Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's African Composers interview. We have a guest composer with us today who is speaking to us from South Africa. Our guest will introduce himself shortly, but before he does, I would like to thank anybody who is watching this interview live for joining us. And I would like to thank anybody who will watch this later as a recorded interview for your interest in the African Composers interviews and the African Composers platform generally. Thank you. So, to our guest, thank you very much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Good afternoon. I'm very well, and thank you for having me.
Fantastic. You're welcome. So please introduce yourself.
My name is Sibusiso Njeza. I am a composer in South Africa. I live in Cape Town, South Africa, in the province of the Western Cape, but I was born in the Eastern Cape, in a place called Butterworth. And originally we are from Tsendane in the Eastern Cape. So I grew up between Butterworth and Tsendane, and that is where my home is, in Tsendane. I grew up in church, in the 12th Apostolic Church, and this is where the love of music was born. Because in the church, there's a lot of music activity that is happening, from the Sunday school to the oldest people we have in church. There's always groups of choirs. And besides the music in church, I was also exposed to a lot of music in the village where I grew up. As boys, we sang wherever we went. And we played guitars, we played drums. So everything we did as boys. Even when we played soccer, we would sing. And those that are standing on the sidelines supporting the soccer team, because I was also a soccer player as a young boy. So there was a lot of singing happening, even at school. There's a very big culture in South Africa of school music. Not necessarily as a subject being taught in class, but choirs who were singing in competitions and Eisteddfods from the lowest levels to the national level. That is so big in South Africa, and it's still happening. But because of COVID-19, the lockdown, we didn't have the competition this year. So that is how my musical upbringing was from the young age. And besides that, my family, even though I don't know any of professional musicians before or composers, but from both sides of my family, music is one of the most loved activities. Even when
Give us a second. I think we're having some technical difficulties. Just give us a second, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, I don't know what happened. Okay, so I was just giving a background of when my musical upbringing started. One story which I always remember, it is when church practices used to take place in our home. When I asked my mother, when did this thing happen? She told me that I was around 3 or 4 years old when this thing happened. I remember the church choir was practicing "And the Glory of the Lord" from the Messiah, which I didn't know at the time. And, I was so fascinated by how these people sang and the fact that they were using papers to read this. They were not listening to a recording and try to imitate the recording, but they were reading something and producing sounds out of this. That was really fascinating for me, and that used to grab my attention, from playing with my friends on the street, playing street football. As soon as they started to sing, I would run and leave the football and go inside the house just to listen to this beautiful music, which I couldn't understand. And as such, by the time they completed the learning of the peace and the glory of the Lord, I had already learned it as well, which I sang over and over and over. So I grew up singing in choir at school. Even in the village, we had a group of Isikatamia, which is the music that was introduced in the main by Ladysmith Black Mambazo in South Africa, a group that won a number of Grammys. So we used to buy their cassettes, play this music, memorize it, and then perform it around the villages there. We used to have concerts. I was one of the lead singers in our Statamia group. So from there, when I got to high school, doing my grade 10, 11, 12, standard 8, 9, 10 at the time, we used to call it standards, not grades. I then joined the high school choir at Msobomvu Senior Secondary School in Butterworth. And this is when the love for choral music was really entrenched. Because at that time, I was still split between choir and football. But the minute I heard that choir sing, I thought this is what I wanted to do. Even though I didn't join the choir right away as I arrived at high school, and my friend who is a singer, Sipho Fubesi, had joined already, but I refused because I still wanted to play football because I really loved football. But then later in the year, I decided, okay, let me join. After hearing these guys sing, I thought, wow, this is just beautiful. And at the time, they were being coached by another African composer, South African composer, Mr. Tandukolo Mahlangeni. So as I listened to their music, I got to appreciate more composed African music because they were singing some of the songs composed by South African composers. And this is when I learned that some of these guys were still alive, because before that, I thought music is composed by dead people. And I never even bothered myself to think, how did they compose it if they are dead? I never thought they were once alive and now they composed the music and then they died. So seeing Mr. Tandukolo Mahlangeni, a living composer, actually fascinated me. And this is around about the same time when the gift of composing, I realized it at that time. How I realized it was kind of singing. Because as I was singing in the choirs, including a community choir called Sakamengo Makoro Society in Butterworth, I began to hear this powerful choir that used to sing in my head. I still hear that music, but I understand it now. Back in the day, it was really confusing for me because there was this choir that constantly sang in my head. And the music that was playing in my head, it's music that I never heard before. So I told my friend, I had a friend named Neba Mahau, who was singing together in the Sakabengo Makora Society choir. And I told him about this choir that is constantly singing in my head. I told him that when this choir begins to sing, it drives me crazy to an extent that I used to have terrible headaches at the time. I was doing standard 9 now. And never tried to understand what is it that I am hearing and how I hear this music and whether or not I've heard the music before. And I told him, no, I've never heard these songs, but they sing. So he asked me, okay, so do you realize when this thing happens, what is it that you are going through at the same time when this music is playing. I would say sometimes I'm happy, sometimes it's when something is bothering me. Then I would always have this music, and it just removes me from my reality into this secluded place where I don't see people, but it's me and this music. At the time, I was not able to write music. I couldn't read music. I depended on what our conductors were teaching us. Then we would memorize that. We couldn't read the notes. So he started to teach me, he started to teach me how to write, because he wanted me to notate what I was hearing. And then I learned that as soon as I learned how to write this music, it would stop playing in my head. And that was the way I started to cope with this thing. So as soon as I hear this music, I would struggle to write it. And then as soon as I write it, then it's gone. So for me, starting to write music was a way to cope with somewhat a disease, which I thought I had at the time, which caused me this terrible headache. So from there, I then realized that, okay, I may have this composing gift, and Neba used to convince me to show these songs to my conductor, which I did a year or two later, and a few songs were tried in the choir, but I was too shy about this thing. I was embarrassed about it. I don't know why, but I felt embarrassed about it because it made me feel abnormal. And when I completed my matric, I then registered for a Bachelor of Music degree at Rhodes University. And before registering for a BMAS degree at Rhodes, when I left home, I was actually going to be doing BCom accounting. That's what my family knew. But secretly, I wanted to do music because in my head, I thought, if I do BCom, of which I really loved accounting, if I went ahead and did BCom, I thought I would really be distracted because music was so powerful in my head at the time. So I decided when I was browsing through the prospectus that we received from Rhodes University, I then saw a Department of Music and Musicology. Then I thought, wow, they have music as a degree. And I applied secretly for music. I didn't tell anyone. And then I went to audition at Rhodes. I was accepted. And then I studied towards my music degree. And at that time, I was now composing as well, freely when I was at school, because immediately when I registered, I got to meet other people who were like me. So I felt better about writing music. I was no longer really embarrassed about it, which I don't know why I was embarrassed in the first place. So between then and now, I have composed a number of single songs and some commissioned works. Like in 2014, I was commissioned to compose Madiba, the African opera. And I'm glad we're doing this interview today on Mandela Day, because it reminds me of the time I was working on that opera. That was composed in 2014, and in 2015, another one titled Blood of Mine. It was commissioned by the Cape Town Opera and was premiered in 2015. And then last year, towards the end of last year, I was again commissioned by the Cape Town Opera to write another opera, a 30-minute opera titled Goka, which means heroes in English. It's an opera composed in Xhosa, an all-female cast opera. The libretto to that opera is written by a woman artist named Asanda Tuma Sopotela. And this opera is looking at two figures that made headlines in South Africa with regards to gender-based violence. The first one is Kwezi. People would remember the name Kwezi in the rape case involving former President Jacob Zuma. So that is one character in the opera. The other one talks to the story of Uyinene Mkhwetyana, a young woman who was brutally murdered by a post office worker in Cape Town last year, and she was a UCT student. So also that character is reflected in the opera, and generally what women are going through in South Africa. So Tuma was trying to get us into the minds of women. What is it that they're thinking? What is it that they're saying behind closed doors? Those kind of conversations. Currently, lastly, I work for the University of the Western Cape, and I'm in the student development and support, the student affairs in many universities. And my role there involves all the performing arts activities for students and projects. That's what I do. I'm not in the academia. Maybe one day I will go back. I recently graduated a master's in business administration, which I thought it would come in handy because as musicians, in most of the time, we only focus on the artistic part of things and forget that there's also the business side of things in music, and that is why sometimes artists die poor. So this is why I did my degree. That one day maybe I would put these together and be able to assist in music departments so that they can also involve the business side of things and not only teach the artistic part, but also teach singers and other musicians how to do business in the proper way and not die poor. So that is Sibusiso Njeza.
Fantastic. That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for taking us through your own personal history from when you started up to today. It's really funny that you said you were embarrassed by your early works. It's really funny because you are somebody whose works have been performed, I guess, across South Africa and even beyond. To think that that's how you were when you first started. And something else that fascinated me is the fact that you singing or taking part in a choir where the works by living composers were being performed, how that's changed you. It took me back to my own experience as well. I can still remember in Nasarawa State in Nigeria, sitting down there with these music, sheets of music, and looking up and seeing the people who are named on the music standing in front of us, teaching us the music, singing with us, playing the instruments. This is unbelievable. I'm actually sitting in front of a composer.
It's really a fascinating experience. And I've been so lucky blessed in my journey as a composer, because I've got to meet the most of the composers that were singing as young boys in school choirs. So I've got to meet all of them. Mr. Van Dijk that you interviewed, I think that was the last interview you had before this one. His father was my composition teacher, Peter Louis Van Dijk, at Rhodes University. So I've got to meet him. Michael Blake, another South African composer who is now in France. He was my teacher. He's still my mentor currently. I've gotten to meet him. Other composers like Pelelane Mnomia, Kenisela Bisi, Professor Malo, and many others in South Africa. I've met them. So it's really fascinating. And I hope musicians out there will actually take the opportunity that these composers are still alive, make contact with them and hear their stories from them. So it's really amazing.
Fascinating. So what we are saying now is that you could have gone into football and we might not have been having this conversation today. Because there's a lot of football in history.
But you know what? I think my ancestors wouldn't have it, because there's something very common about my journey in football. from when I was playing for the under 12s, under 15s, under 17s, under 19s, even at university, every time, a day before the game, I would be injured. And that's it. I wouldn't go play in the tournament. If I had a chance to play in the first round of the tournament, when we go to the next one or the finals, I would be injured and be on the sidelines. So that's how my days in football were. Even at university, I trialed when I was doing my second year. I trialed for the Rhodes team, and I was accepted. But after 1 or 2 games, I got injured badly. So on my ankle, I still feel that injury. So that's when I stopped playing. Of course, now that I've healed, I do play. We have a staff team at UWC. So I also play every now and then, but I'm very wary of the injuries that I've had in the past. So my ancestors wouldn't have it.
Okay. As you said, across the world, different people celebrate Mandela Day today. And I saw a post on your timeline. Apparently, part of your opera will be performed in a concert today or at an event today. Can you tell us about what is planned for today?
Yes, there's a concert that is taking place at 12 o'clock US time. It's going to be 6 p.m. in South Africa, whereby it's UN Chamber Music Society. They are running a Nelson Mandela Day special, a concert where Nelson Mandela's grandson, Ndaba Mandela, will be speaking as well. And another South African artist, Vusinova, will be singing there. And 2 excerpts from Madiba, the African opera, will be performed. Mezzo-soprano arias will be performed by a wife of one of Madiba's grand-nephews, Unonhlanhla Mthikaka, who is the wife of the late Unathi Mthikaka, the man who commissioned the opera, but unfortunately he passed on in 2017. So it's happening at 6 o'clock South African time this evening.
Okay, and it's under the auspices of the United Nations. Well done. Congratulations. That's Madiba, the African opera, composed by our guest of today. And it's a real pity. I think one of Mandela's relatives passed away recently. Was it his granddaughter, if I remember correctly?
That is her daughter.
Oh, gosh.
Her daughter, Mamzinzi. She passed on a few days ago. Yeah.
Congratulations again on the opera. Why operas for you? Why? You've composed a few.
I didn't actually choose to write the operas, more especially Madiba, the African opera, because before I was commissioned to write this work, I hadn't written any opera before that, or any large-scale work. I've attempted to write some extended works, but I would just leave it in the middle and then just release individual songs. But Unathi, the late Unathi Mthikaka, actually believed that I could do this, even though I didn't believe I could do it. So he convinced me into doing it. But as we were working on this opera, it actually dawned to me that opera music is not foreign to Africans, because all our stories are narrated in music. And we've always been doing this. You go to traditional ceremonies in most cultures in Africa, you find that stories are narrated through music. So for me, operas are a very good vehicle that we can use to narrate our stories and to advance African history. Because if you follow the Nelson Mandela story in the Madiba, the African opera, that is a story of everyone who was around Madiba. It's a story of Africans. It's a story of South Africans. It's not necessarily his individual story. You get to learn about how the Tembu people in the Eastern Cape lived, where he was born in Umvezo, Qunu, to Mqhekezweni, to Johannesburg, when he was in Robben Island, and when he became president. That is our history. It's not his history as an individual. So for me, operas are a good vehicle to advance African stories. And I wish operas can be supported by our governments, or especially when the content theme is an African story. We need more funding for that.
Okay, so it appears that being commissioned actually helps. It helps you move from a place of doubt or delay or postponement to delivery. Does that help?
Yeah, it does, because when the opera is commissioned, for instance, I haven't attempted to write any story. I don't think that is where my talent is, to write stories. Maybe I can narrate my own story, but I haven't really attempted to write any story. So you need someone who is going to write a story. You also need someone who is going to adapt that story into a libretto that is going to fit the opera, who understands how the opera goes in terms of arias, choruses, duets, trios, ensembles. So you need that. And also, for that opera to be performed, you will have to have the orchestra, you will have the singers, everybody, dancers. In the case of Madiba, the African opera, there's quite a lot that is going on there. Money that you wouldn't have as a composer, and it takes time to write an opera. So that is why it's important that we get commissioned.
You talked about working closely with people. Did you work closely with any of Mandela's family members? I think the librettist was a family member of his.
Yes, the librettist is the grandson of King Jongintaba. King Jongintaba is the man who raised Madiba after his father passed on. His father, Gadla Mpakanyiswa, passed on, and I think he was about 7 years old. And when he passed on, it's actually one of the areas that will be performed this evening, whereby Madiba actually, his father, Gadla Mpakanyiswa, had told his wife Nosekeni that if he dies, he would want Nosekeni to take the young Nelson to a place called Mqhekezweni, where King Jongintaba lived. And this is where Madiba would be raised. And that's where he started schooling until he became a man. He was raised by King Jongintaba. And in Mqhekezweni, he grew up with his cousin, the son of King Jongintaba, King Justice Mtikhaga. So they grew up together. So Unati is the grandson of Justice Mtikhaga. And Nonhlanhla, who will be performing this evening, is the wife of Unati.
Okay. Again, congratulations.
And during the time we were working on the opera, the late Zinzi Mandela was also part of the people who were helping us, and Mandela as well, and also the late Gogo Winnie Madikizela Mandela as well. They were very supportive of the opera. In fact, the great man himself, when we finished the opera, that's when he passed on in December 2013. We had conversations with him, but he was very ill when we started earlier in 2013. So he was also supportive of that opera.
Okay, well done. And it must have been quite an experience for you getting to work with all of these people who are closely related to Mandela, and even getting to have conversations with almost directly with him. So well done. You are quite well known and quite highly respected across South Africa in the classical music scene, in the arts scene. So I'm sure you get opportunities, you create opportunities for yourself. But are there any challenges you face today, even as a well-known, established composer?
Yes, there are various challenges that we all experience. Firstly, it's what I referred to earlier on, the funding for the arts. In most cases, when the government wants to make cuts, the arts would always be on the firing line. And unfortunately, in most cases, the most number of choirs in South Africa are found in rural areas or in townships. And it's very difficult for them to work without funding. And this is where I come from. I come from that culture of community choirs. So that kind of struggle is still there, even to date. But at least because I work for a university, certain challenges are mitigated because there would be a bit of funding here and there that one gets from the universities. But also the singers that we work with, that I also work with, like they didn't study music at high school, and I see that, or I find that as a challenge, because when you look at countries where music is really vibrant, students would have, or singers would have learned music, how to read music in school as a subject. But in South Africa, we have less of that, unfortunately. And now that becomes a challenge when you are teaching a choir, or when you are workshopping other conductors or adjudicators, because most people just learn things by rote. They learned by being in the choir. They learned, over a period of time. They are not really graduates in music. So those are some of the challenges that we face. And currently we are on lockdown. Musicians are really having it hard. I consider myself one of the blessed people because I work for an institution, but other musicians depend on having concerts, on having performances, on open concerts and events that are taking place. But unfortunately, all of those kind of things are burned in the lockdown rules. So those are the kind of challenges that I also face as a musician.
Okay, I will just read out one of the questions that one of our viewers has posted before we carry on with the rest of the interview. He asked, okay, how long did it take you to write your first opera?
If I remember correctly, I'm one of those people that when I start something, it's very difficult to put it on the side. So writing that first opera, I think it took about 3 months, but we then had to do back and forth, fixing things. But to write the music to the libretto that I was given, I think it took about 3 months to complete. Thereafter, we started back and forth, polishing here and there, twisting the story, the language, and yeah, so that's how it took me.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Anybody else, if you have a question, feel free to post it and we will consider posing it to our guest of the day. Do you mind if we just stay with opera for a bit longer?
Okay, no problem.
Does South Africa have other heroes, past or present, so people who've passed away or people who are still alive, about whom your composers will consider writing other operas? I've seen some operas already, of course, but I want to ask you the question. Do you have other heroes, other figures, historical figures that you think? I'm not trying to say that South Africa, in a way, the music revolves around Mandela, Madiba. No, I'm just saying, are there other heroes for which there are operas that should be written? What do you think to record this history you are talking about?
Yes, there are many. There are many. if you read the history of South Africa, more especially the kings that were there in South Africa earlier, like for instance King Shaka of the Zulus, there is an extended work that Professor Mzilikazi Khumalo, which at times is not regarded as an opera, but he wrote about King Shaka Kasenza Ngakona. If you look at the Xhosa history, we've got kings like King Yinta and other people who did great work to put South Africa where it is today. So I believe there are many other heroes, even ordinary men and women who were not kings or queens or political heads of organizations. No, but ordinary people who did ordinary stuff. Those kind of people, I think they deserve their stories to be written and be put on stage.
Okay. There is one more question, but before you address this one, can I just again dwell on the opera thing for a bit longer? You said it's a useful vehicle for telling stories. Now, I'm concerned about some things around the way we do things in Africa. Do you think that we are using an existing vehicle, and by doing so, we are not putting in enough effort to create our own vehicle? There's nothing wrong with opera. It's been used, historically, globally. But are we perhaps not spending enough time thinking about creating our own form of music to tell our stories?
I think it's all about the style you are using to narrate the story. You might actually not conform to some of the Western norms in writing your music, and maybe use. I know there are composers like Bongani Makatyana, a South African composer again, who writes a lot of folk music, and he uses that music as part of his storytelling. You see, even in the Madiba, the African opera, there is music that is composed in a Western style, but some of the music is traditional music that you find in the Xhosa culture, because we're using the language of Xhosa, and the story revolves from the Eastern Cape. So I believe we should incorporate a lot of African music and African idioms in writing these kind of stories, so that they truly reflect what African music and what we're about in Africa. And when we're writing the Madiba, the African opera, we're also confined by the available budget in terms of instrumentation. There are some instruments African instruments we wanted to use, but were rather expensive to obtain at the time. So we decided that, okay, we have an orchestra that is already available to us. Let's rather use some extended position of violins and other instruments, so that we make them sound more like some of the African instruments, like umkhube in the Xhosa culture, and other African instruments that we have available. So I also believe, like you just said, we need not to dwell on the past in terms of how we write the music. We need to allow things to evolve. We need to involve a lot of African ways of writing music. But I don't want to confine anyone into writing in a particular style. No, people must express themselves the way they know how to.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, let us look at this question from one of our viewers. The question is, are you currently, or do you have any idea of composing about this pandemic?
Not really. Not really. I'm not sure if I'm going to write anything about this pandemic, but I think there are a lot of lessons to learn There are a lot of lessons to learn about this pandemic. For instance, in South Africa, it actually exposed how unequal a society we are in South Africa. And so instead of writing about the pandemic, I would rather look at a story that really exposes further how unequal this society is. Because currently, when you shut down parts of the economy, there are people who are mostly hard hit, who were already hard hit by the economy even before the lockdown. So those kind of dynamics, and when the lockdown was introduced with the stage 5, when it was just total shutdown of the country, the questions were asked: how do you then ask people who are living in the squatter camps to quarantine and to live in that small space when there's like 10 of them, and not go on the streets where they normally hustle? So those kind of questions, these are the kind of stories that I would rather be focusing on instead of writing about the pandemic specifically.
Okay. I think that brings us to the next question quite nicely. What are your inspirations and influences?
Um, I'm influenced by a lot of things. Anything good actually inspires me, because I'm a teacher. Even though I stopped teaching, after 5 years, I stopped teaching to join the student affairs. I'm inspired by love. I'm inspired by peace. I'm inspired by the good that people do. I'm inspired by people who think beyond the obvious, beyond the normal. I always want to challenge myself, and I'm influenced greatly by it's a lot. It's a lot, because I'm also learning about my gift every day. I'm learning about my gift. So I don't really look up to one thing, to influence me. I'm influenced by the church. I'm influenced by the environment I'm in at university. I'm influenced by the people I grew up with in my village. I'm influenced by those that live in townships. Whatever that I believe builds us as people. That is my greatest influence.
Okay. And can you tell us which African composers you admire most?
um, Firstly, it's the composers that it's not just one composer. There are many others I discover as I go, but I grew up being mentored by the composer I mentioned, Tandukolo Mahlangeni, who was my first composer mentor. There are composers like Pelelani Mnomia, who are always experimenting with new things, new styles of writing. That really inspires me a lot. It challenges me to keep working. People like Konisela, Sibisi. I once met Justinian Tamusuza. I think he's from Uganda. I met him here in South Africa. I can't remember the year. I think it was 2005. One brilliant African composer, and composers like Christopher Tin, one of the most brilliant ones. So there are many composers that I really admire from Africa.
Do you collaborate with other composers? And if somebody who is watching this now or who watches this later wants to collaborate with you, what is your criteria? What standard should they meet? Obviously, very high standard. But do you collaborate? And what's the criteria you set for people that you'll be happy to work with?
Honestly, I do not set standards. I must say, even though it's always great to produce quality, because that's how we grow. The reason why I'm saying this is because I have not reached the level which I think you think I'm at. But that's a conversation for another day. Um, Before I got to this current level that I'm in, there are people who were already established who gave me an opportunity, who allowed me into their space, who trusted me, who gave me an opportunity, to learn. So this is why I'm saying I can't be now saying, okay, I can only collaborate with so and not anyone who wants to collaborate. I've collaborated with singers in terms of ideas on how to write a song that one would want to sing. I've collaborated with conductors who would want me to compose a piece that they would conduct and sing with or perform with their choir. I've not really collaborated with a composer, but it's something that I would want to do, except when I was writing Blood of Mine, the opera that was commissioned by Cape Town Opera. I didn't have enough time when I was writing that opera, so I had to ask another composer to collaborate in terms of orchestrating the work. As I was writing, I think I only had 1 month to complete that opera. So as I was writing, we're just discussing what I would have done orchestrating the piece. So I would write the piece and send it to him. Alan Stevenson, a composer here in Cape Town. So that was a sort of a forced collaboration, which I enjoyed and I learned a lot out of it. So I would really want to collaborate with anyone, even composers who are outside of South African borders, so that we can see how what we do could come together and what product we can come up with.
Okay, just to address what you said earlier, anybody who is watching this, please Google or look up our guest composer of today, and you will see that yes, he is exactly the way he's being presented. Don't let him make you think that he's not at that level. He is. He's a very famous composer, very well established. His name appears in so many articles talking about South African composers, highly accomplished and well-respected composers. In fact, let us look at what one of those articles says about you and two other South African, I believe they are South African composers. So this was an interview with somebody who created an orchestra, set up an orchestra in South Africa. So I'm going to ask you a question tied into what she said. But what she said here is, I have dedicated all of Anchored Sound, so what she's working on orchestra, to showcasing the music of great composers, including our guest of today, Sibusiso Njeza. She said these are just some of the African music storytellers who are on the same wavelength in terms of creativity and writing with the likes of Stravinsky, Haydn, Prokofiev, and Tchaikovsky. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the level at which our guest composer of today is. Don't let him play it down. So it's brilliant. Thank you very much for putting out the invitation. Anybody who wants to collaborate with our guest composer, feel free to reach out to him. He's ready to consider your ideas, your suggestions, and consider working with you. Can you take us through your process, please? The process of composing a work, starting from what to the finished production. Can you just take us through the whole process?
Okay. It varies depending on what kind of work I'm working on and whether or not the piece was either commissioned or it's something that I am writing out of my own inspiration. So let me start with pieces that I write out of my own inspiration. In most cases, it happens the way I described how I discovered my gift. Say, for instance, there's something that really hurt me, or something that I was happy about, or something that I wanted to say. At some point, I'm just going to feel overwhelmed with this music in my head. And that's how it always begins. It is the music in my head. In most cases, I would hear the music, and the text would not be as clear as the music. So I would then start by notating the music, and try to remove myself from noisy areas so that I can listen some more. So currently, I am that kind of a composer that has to listen to that inner voice. What is the voice saying? What is the music saying? And at some point, the same music that I was hearing without words would actually come with words. So partly it happens. Sometimes I would be wanting to write about whatever topic that I want to write about, and I would have the words and just jot the words down, and and then keep the words there. At some point, the music is going to come. As it comes, I will try to match it with the words. So that's how I compose the music that I compose voluntarily. Then there are pieces that have been commissioned. Like, for instance, I would be commissioned to write a piece about Owar Tambo. There was a festival which ran up until 2017, the Melting Pot, where they were celebrating Owar Tambo in most cases. So composers would have to submit pieces about Owar Tambo. With that one, I would have to read the story of Owar Tambo, read the story. I'm not one of those composers who are good at narrating a story where the person comes from, what they did, and. I wait for the inspiration. As soon as the story becomes my own, then the music comes. And as it comes, the kind of language that I must use, whether it must be in the form of idioms or it's just plain, simple language, it comes. If it's poetic, it comes like that. So that is a commissioned piece. I can never write until it feels like it's my own. Then when it comes to operas, that's the most difficult one, because sometimes I would be forced to write a love aria because the scene requires a love aria. This is when now I have to become many different characters. In most cases, the librettists that I've worked with, from Madiba, the African opera, to the latest one, they would recall one thing that is common. After reading the story, I would have a comment that I don't see this person. I remember in Madiba, the African opera, I couldn't see Zinzi, the character of Zinzi Mandela. I couldn't see her because I didn't know her a lot at the time. And Unati tried to explain this character. I could understand perfectly all other characters, but this one figure, until I discovered a clip when she was reading a letter that her father, Nelson Mandela, had written from prison, rejecting a proposal that he was to be released with certain conditions. So he rejected that. So he was at Jabulani Stadium in Joburg reading this thing. She was there, Zinzi, reading this thing because her mother, Winnie Mandela, was burned from all those kinds of public gatherings. So as I watched this character, I saw how I would say how cheeky the kind of character she was, how radical she was, as young as she was, and how powerful a figure. That's when I could be able to relate. So with opera, I have to become all those characters in order to tell the story of each of the characters in the manner in which I understand the character.
Okay, thank you very much for taking us through your process. There is a question here from someone called the Family Institute. I think it's actually a group. They say, as an organization that deals with gender-based violence, we have just learned that gender-based violence hits hard in remote areas, remote rural areas, especially during this lockdown. What role can composers play in bringing awareness about gender-based violence in such areas?
This is a very important question, and a very important role that we as composers need to consider. There's one line that I always use, that music and love are the only languages that know no race, that know no color. Those two things, music and love. You can love a person without understanding their language. You can love a person without belonging to their culture or belonging to their country. You can fall in love with a piece of music without understanding what the music says. In terms of the language, you can fall in love with a piece of music without understanding the style of that music, but it can actually hit you. I'm saying this because I want composers to understand that when you put these kind of messages condemning gender-based violence, educating both men and women about gender-based violence, encouraging women to report and men who are being abused, but in most cases it's women, encouraging them to report, offering support, discouraging men from being violent towards women, and feeling entitled to the lives of women. Music could play a big role there. Kids singing about messages on gender-based violence, that would actually be instilled in their heads. Whatever you put in music for kids, they will remember forever. And for adults as well, there are songs that we grew up singing without really knowing what they meant at the time, but we still know the lyrics to those songs today, which means we learned the message. So this question about what composers can play, it's a very important one. Composers need to start writing about these stories, not only classical or choral composers, but every composer, from pop to kwaito to jazz to gospel. We have to fight against gender-based violence.
That's absolutely brilliant. Yes. Writing children's songs. I think that's really important, starting from the youngs. As you said, as we grow, these messages are already instilled in us in the form of songs. So fantastic.
Yes.
Really good advice. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. There's a feedback from one of our earlier questioners. He said he asked the pandemic question because he remembers you wrote a song once about HIV AIDS. The song is Know Your Status. Do you remember that? And can you tell us about that?
The difference between then and now, of course, HIV and AIDS is a pandemic as well, but the campaigns there were raising awareness. Even now, there are short pieces that some creatives have written about sanitizing, washing your hands, keeping a social distance, and but back then we had to put messages out there so that people are aware, because people were not dying immediately like it's happening now. They were not dying immediately and recovering from HIV and AIDS. People would contract HIV and live with it for a long time. And some people were living with HIV without knowing that they had AIDS, and now they were infecting other people. So it was important that people were sensitized about using condoms, protecting themselves, watching out in terms of when there's an accident, not touching the blood. So we had to do that. Also, with those songs, some composers were writing about eating healthy and living a healthy lifestyle, like exercising and doing other things. So that is why composers were writing about HIV and AIDS. And those songs were being sung at schools in that choral Eisteddfod I was talking about. So that we can educate kids as well to help their parents in their homes.
Okay. All right, thank you. Well, we are about to end the interview, but I would like to just push through two more questions, if you don't mind. So I read part of an article in which you were described as a great composer. What makes a composer a great composer?
Oh, do I know? No, I think each composer has an opportunity to be great, whatever that means. If you consider yourself as a student all the time, that you have to learn. There's not a time in a life of an artist where one must feel, I know it all. You have to learn. When you look back in some songs you composed 10 years ago, you always feel, I could have done that differently. That actually means you've learned in the last 10 years. For as long as you feel you can actually improve from what you did 10 years ago. So I think keeping yourself in that route of learning and empowering yourself and listening to other people. One last thing which I think helps composers grow. I said it. I had in sort of an interview conversation with a choir from Tshwane University of Technology on Thursday evening. One of the questions they asked, it was about the importance of singing South African music, composed music by South African composers. And part of my response to that question was that one of the reasons why I think Western composers were good is that they were able to hear their music. They would compose a song and a copyist would make copies and musicians would play that music. And once your music is played or performed, you get an opportunity to hear it. You get an opportunity to sort of critique your own work. There's feedback that you get. So I want to encourage singers, ensembles, orchestras, companies to consider giving chance to composers, because that's how you grow as a composer. If I would be shelving my pieces since I started writing in 1999, I would not be where I am today, because those pieces would be at the same level throughout. And you have to try new things, be open to experiment. So that's what I think.
Okay, thank you. I think you've sort of addressed the second question I was going to ask. So that means I get one extra. I just want to ask you how your online workshop, the Choralist, Conversations with Sibusiso Njeza, how those workshops are going, if everything going well, and why did you start those workshops?
Those workshops, those conversations are going very well. The response is good. And that's not the reason why I'm doing it. I'm not doing it so that I can trend or I can accumulate a number of followers or to build that page. No, I realized I've been wanting to do this for the last 5 years, but I was really consumed by my work as a conductor, because I'm a choir conductor. So I thought, now that there's a lockdown and I'm not really working directly with the choir, it's time that I must set up this thing. The reason why I'm doing this, it's exactly why you're doing these conversations. There's a lot of programs on radio and on TV across the continent where the music is played. But whenever you hear music by Sibusiso Njeza, you don't know Sibusiso Njeza, you only know the music. But when a piece from Requiem Mass by Mozart is played, you immediately know that, this guy died in 1791. His father was so and so, and this is what he did. At age 4, he was doing this. He composed his first piece at this age. This is what he did. And these are the other works that he composed, even the ones you've never heard of. You know about him. You know about Beethoven. You know about Handel. You know Bach. But when I say to you, there's a composer in South Africa named Tom Sicholwana, you don't know him. But Mr. Tom Sicholwana has been writing music for as long as I have lived. So this is the main reason. When we speak about great conductors, James Levine and other conductors, Leonard Bernstein, all those conductors, we know about them. But when we speak about South African or African composers in general, conductors, we don't know those people. We know about all the singers of the world, but we don't know our African singers. So I started this conversation so that I can invite prominent musicians and those that are not really prominent, so that we can get an opportunity to get to know them. I know for a fact there are people who are seeing me for the first time in this conversation. They've never heard of me before. They've never even seen the name. You're saying that name is all over the place. Some people have never. But because you started this conversation, now people are going to follow me. They're going to know me. They're going to want to know more about the work that I'm doing. Like tomorrow, I'm having a conversation with Maestro Mzwandile Matthews, one of the greatest conductors we've ever had in this country. But I can tell you, I don't remember a single comprehensive interview that lasts for an hour or two that he's ever had in this country. And this man has been in this choral field for more than 50 years. His choir is celebrating 40 years. He was the conductor of the same choir since 1979. He's still that conductor and going stronger. But all that we know is that he conducts, nothing else. What drives him, we don't know. What makes him tick, we don't know. So that is why I started the Choralist Conversations.
Fantastic. There is a question on the screen waiting for you. One of the guests says, or is asking, I would really love to sing your songs. By the way, I know who this audience member is. He's a very well-known singer in my own country, Nigeria. So he said he would really love to sing your songs, and he wants to know where he can find them.
That's another challenge we are currently having. There is no place where our music can be accessed except directly from me or people who are just copying left, right, and center without considering music rights. So I'm currently working on setting up a place online where people can get my music. But he can just inbox me on Facebook now, then we'll take the conversation from there. And anyone else who wants to make a contact, then we can take it from there.
Okay, fantastic. It's been really, really interesting talking to you today. Thank you very much for this detailed introduction, the history of how you started, where you are today. Thank you to everybody who is watching us live. We have quite a few people. Thank you for the questions, the feedback, the comments. It's been really interesting talking to you. Thank you very much, Sibusiso. We wish you the best with your future endeavors, and we hope that you keep in touch with the African Composers platform.
And thank you so much for having me. This has been a wonderful conversation. I didn't realize that we were over 1 hour already. It was just getting fun. Thank you so much. Definitely, I will keep in touch with the African composers, the conversations, and the Facebook page, and the website as well. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.